The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. It's so great to be starting another orchestration challenge this year, and especially featuring the work of such a worthy and long-neglected, unjustly suppressed composer. From my perspective here at the beginning of the process, I've just scored my own orchestration of Barvinsky's beautifully eloquent prelude in G major, and I haven't even officially announced it yet. All of that is yet to come. But soon, I'll be telling everyone about this year's challenge, and then the entries will start to come in. Right here in my timeline, though, I haven't seen a single score from anyone yet, and my mind is completely focused on the work I've just done. Which makes this the perfect time for me to record a few lectures covering my orchestration, to be released in a couple of months when the challenge closes on the 19th of August, 2022. As you probably noticed at the beginning of that mock-up, I didn't include the full instrumentation on the first page. This was purely to make that screen more readable. I'll discuss this in more detail later in the video, but before we get into that, let's start with the first section of piano score. In these lectures, that will be the strategy, outlining what I feel are the challenges presented in the original score in detail, one section at a time, playing the piano along to that section, and then lecturing about my own orchestration of the section, followed by an additional review of those pages along to an excerpt of the mock-up we just heard. This time around, I'll be using the pages I'm preparing for the upcoming evaluations guide, in which I list this year's participants, the order in which their scores will be released, the ground rules I'm setting for myself in evaluating each score, and the general criteria I'll be using in assessing the effectiveness of each score's approach. It's from this last group of images that I'll be borrowing pages, and I hope that will help to illustrate my points with a lot more directness, in a way that will be more memorable to my viewers and fellow orchestrators. So let's start with the first section, as I've indicated as Rehearsal A. Of course, in a standard concert score, a true rehearsal mark might not occur until the 11th bar of this piece, but I'm using the marking as a way of easily identifying the different sections of the piece among dozens, or perhaps even hundreds of entries at several different levels of participation. You'll notice that this year, I gave my website subscribers and minimum-level Patreon supporters a pretty generous portion of the beginning of Barvinsky's prelude to orchestrate. Not just the opening thematic statement, but also a full 8 bars of the a-tempo section, where the piece really gets underway. That's for my benefit as well as yours. I felt that offering only 10 bars for the first section would be way too skimpy, and not really show me what each orchestrator could do with their craft and imaginations. A little note here on the engraving. I'm using the Norfolk music font, based on the Bravura font developed by the team at Dorico, along with the text font Nepomuk, which I feel is the most true to the characters one sees in older engraved editions. Though, at least in Sibelius, there are still some issues with Nepomuk as applied to ottava lines. I've linked the sources for those fonts in the information below. Back to our first section of Barvinsky. Let's go over each element, each orchestrational concern, if you will, one by one. Our first concern is essentially the same as last year's piece, Andaluza by Manuel de Falla. The pitch weight of the music is in the upper middle register of the piano. Of course, the context of that element relates to both this piece and that piece in different ways. Andaluza started with a massive, almost brutal forte section that went on for a full 24 bars before hitting a truly solid bass note. Here with the prelude in G, it's a different kind of concern. While it's fewer bars until we get to a richer, deeper bass note, it's actually a longer span of time. Andaluza's first couple dozen bars are about 20 seconds long, while here in the Barvinsky, the opening is more like 45 seconds long. So the orchestrator has to decide whether to stick to the exact range of pitches, possibly limiting the sound picture for 3/4 of a minute, teasing a few lower pitches here and there before the a-tempo, which is less restricted but may affect the unique, suspended feeling of the opening, or to flesh out the first 10 bars with a lot of added bass register notes. There are ways of making each strategy work beautifully, which I'm sure we'll see in the upcoming entries from all of this year's participants. Now let's break down that opening, starting with the melody. The beautiful thing about this opening, at least to me, is the emotional progression, from a very elegant simplicity, then rising up in hope or aspiration, then descending thoughtfully to a point of tension, and finally a slightly bittersweet resolution. So the challenge presented to me as an orchestrator is how to underline those evolving emotions through expression and development of instrumental timbre. The added concern is that though the voicing of the chordal melody has some little variations here and there, the proportions remain more or less the same until the last two bars. A simple octave melody in the right hand, over the left hand's complementary harmony and or countermelody in thirds. At the andante sostenuto tempo of this passage, the overall motion is somewhat slow, and if the colors don't change and progress to underline the emotional arc, then the opening statement could sound rather static, even a bit dull. On top of all that, or actually in the middle I should say, is this little harmonized line serving as a codetta. How clear can I orchestrate this, so that it will bring the statement to a close emotionally, timbrally, and yet set up the full-blooded restatement to follow? Moving on, we see essentially the same elements in the upper two staves, but an expansion of scope. The meter changes from 6/4 to 12/8, implying a quicker pace, even with a stricter interpretation of the marking a tempo. The pianist's left hand is given double duty in both tracking the right-hand octave melody in thirds, and supplying arpeggiation in between those sustained notes. So we have to ask ourselves to what degree this expansion of score represents an expansion of those emotional and timbral qualities from the opening statement. Is a continued progression of those qualities in the instrumentation warranted? And if so, to what degree? Meanwhile, we're confronted by an even deeper quandary: how to interpret the very pianistic patterns of the bottom staff without sounding like a very forced, derivative orchestration. This, by the way, is a constant quandary in orchestrating a certain type of piano music, especially Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff, and so on. While left-hand patterns lend a beautiful flow and sense of rhythm to a piano piece, they can be difficult to transform in a naturally orchestral way, to the extent that piece after piece adapted from piano to orchestra that tackles this problem can start to sound somewhat mechanistic and less than idiomatic. So what I recommend is to avoid the predictable, like harp covering patterns throughout an entire passage, let alone an entire piece. It may be worth the orchestrator's while to adapt the patterns into something that makes a whole lot more sense with winds or strings, capturing the energy and flow, but perhaps changing the order of the notes in some way, not to mention any widely spanning sweep across registers. And yet that's not all we have to think about. There's also the issue, which I'll mention in my planned pitfalls video. You'll probably have already seen it by the time this video comes out. The issue of how the interaction of the left hand across the two bottom staves creates middle voices. In Violina Petrochenko's terrific recording, you can clearly hear how much meaning she brings into these middle voices, which beautifully ties together the outer elements, the octave melody above and the arpeggiation below. And yet they have their own unique voice in the music. So that's yet another concern. How can I interpret those discrete voices in the center of the sound picture without distracting from the melody above or overly dominating the arpeggiation below? Fix all these issues in your mind. The need of the opening statement to reflect a textural and emotional progression in order not to drag. The choices presented about the upper middle register pitch weight. The clarity of the middle voices setting up the restatement. And then in the next section, how the piano scoring's expansion of scope might require the same from the orchestra, all while avoiding slavish replication of left-hand patterns, and bringing out those middle voices in a way that strengthens rather than distracts from the other elements. Think about all those concerns while I play a reference recording along to this screen, and then we'll take a look at my strategies for solving these problems. Now for my orchestration. But before we jump into that too deeply, let's take a look at my choice of instruments. Here we can see all the instruments, as should be properly displayed in most scores on the first page, which we didn't see in the run-through of the mock-up at the beginning of the video. Starting at the top, I've played by my own rules by limiting my winds to 3 from each family. As to auxiliaries, it's pretty much a standard third wind player of each group on a dedicated auxiliary throughout the piece. With the exception of second flute on piccolo, which occurs later in the piece, and third flute on alto, starting from the first bar. Since I'll be suggesting sticking to the standard 1 auxiliary per family in the guidelines, I'm going slightly out of my own wheelhouse here, but scoring alto flute and piccolo isn't that big of an ask from the average flute section of a pro orchestra. Everything else is standard: 2 oboes plus English horn, 2 clarinets plus bass clarinet, and 2 bassoons plus contra. Just a brief comment on using clarinets in A. G major is a bit of a borderline key signature when it comes to assigning A or B-flat clarinets. If a piece is trending counterclockwise in its modulations, in other words, toward naturals and flats, then B-flat clarinets are a better option. They may also be requested by some student and community players. On the other hand, in a concert allegro, where there's usually a modulation toward sharps, then A clarinets are a better fit. Especially in a piece like this one, which is overflowing with sharps and double sharps in the middle, you may very well need A clarinets to the exclusion of B-flat clarinets. That was the choice I made here, and it's justified by some furious passages coming up, which I'll cover in the next lecture. Dropping down the page, my choice of brass instruments is a pretty standard 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, and tuba, with one little exception. I've chosen to score an E-flat sopranino for one of my trumpet players. This would be the most standard of today's piccolo trumpets, and often D trumpet parts are played on an E-flat. Some E-flat models have interchangeable slides and bells that turn them into D trumpets. I might supply an alternate part in D, though most pro players I know wouldn't need a transposed part or even to play in D in the first place. I'll talk about this in more detail in the next 2 lectures, where the E-flat trumpet really comes into its own, adding some muscle to the upper limits of the brass section. But for now, I'd say that just like alto flute and piccolo for the flutes, this is not that much of an ask for the trumpet section. A little further down we come to the percussion and harp. I've kept things really simple, as this is not all that percussive of a piece for the most part, though I'm expecting some hugely bombastic interpretations. Not just expecting, looking forward to them. I'm sure there will be some awesome outbursts of passion. But for my own outbursts, I'm limiting my bombast to timpani, cymbals, bass drum, and glockenspiel. The Glock can do anything I'd need a celesta to do in my conception of this piece, so that saves a player. But I will be using the harp here and there for judiciously placed and hopefully very effective icing, commentary, and the occasional patterning. And, of course, the strings are just the strings. Nothing fancy here, like viola d'amore or violoncello piccolo. So let's jump to the screen with all the blank staves taken out, enabling me to display a much more readable staff size. I've left in the piano staves as well for the purposes of this in-depth lecture, though I'll be recommending that participants leave them out of their entries. By the time we've looked over a dozen or so entries, I'm sure most of us will have them memorized. This page just covers the opening statement, and that's quite enough to start with. As I hope you'll recall, our first concern was pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano. And as you can see, I've taken the middle path in my scoring, adding a couple of lower notes here and there to open out the scope of the music slightly, but not so much that it spoils the contrast to the textural expansion on the next page. Otherwise, I've mainly stuck to the registers of Barvinsky's piano score, at least here. But I didn't have to. I could have reinterpreted the harmony, scored certain lines an octave higher or lower, and adapted the score in many different ways. That's the beauty of this challenge, that we're going to see many different interpretations of this work, all valid to the instincts and interpretation of each individual orchestrator. My job will be to comment on each entry's strengths, and suggest ways of making certain strategies even more effective, along with other hopefully useful feedback. As to my own entry here, I've chosen to start the emotional journey through this passage with very simple note-for-note scoring in the upper winds. First flute and first oboe playing the octave melody, with alto flute and English horn covering the thirds below. Don't be fooled by the notes of the alto flute appearing to be the same pitches as the first oboe. Actually, they're transposed, sounding down a perfect fourth throughout the phrase. If the players are really starting softly yet clearly, then all the voices, including the lowest two, should balance fairly well. Normally, I might have a concern here with the alto flute being overpowered by the oboe and English horn on either side, except for a few caveats. Of course, as I just mentioned, the dynamic is piano, which will help the softer alto flute to balance. But there's also the combining of the flute and oboe in octaves, which tempers both instruments, and the natural tendency of the English horn to blend and even merge with flute family instruments from below, if not pushed too loudly. Then there's also the interweaving of instruments which will help bond their timbres. Flute on top, then oboe, alto flute, and English horn. When added all together, the texture has a pearly quality. Let's have a listen to these first 3 bars, and you be the judge. I feel that the note performer mock-up is fairly accurate to the strengths and timbres of the instruments here. Notice how I'm setting up the emotional progression. We just heard the phrase reach upward, somewhat tentatively as scored with the original quartet of winds. Now I need to take the echo of that first cautious leap upward and flush it with more color and warmth, but not too much. I don't want to overdo it. First flute and first oboe maintain their octave roll, doubled by first and second violins, a simple enough combination. The finesse, such as there might be, is in the lower voices, pianissimo horns with no crescendo, doubled by violas at first, with bassoon doubling cellos on the lower tied notes that help to ground the harmony and give it context. The lower part turns into simple parallel thirds. The cellos and violas take the upper and lower voices, with the bassoon continuing to double the cellos. There's no need to double the violas, because even at pianissimo, the horns will continue to be the most sonorous element at the end of the phrase. The little upward arpeggiation from harp helps to add emotional closure and to set up the change of character in the next phrase. Taking a chance on the blended sound of the winds at the beginning is what I would call a Goss touch, something personally characteristic of my scoring style. Here's another such example, sending the alto flute into its upper register. Don't be fooled by disparaging comments about the alto flute's higher notes. They're not weak, bad-sounding, or inconsequential. They're just a different quality, hollower, cooler, with a touch of graininess if pushed. That's exactly what I want here, a reaction to the previous little flush of emotion that pulls back a little, perhaps to a scene of village life after looking out over the dawn-soaked horizon. Upper register alto flute has a kind of folk-like character. Adding clarinet an octave below actually warms the alto's timbre by strengthening odd-numbered partials that might be weaker up there. The result is an almost oboe-like combined tone, but not quite. Notice that I really keep all the other elements backed way off here, so as not to overwhelm the alto flute, and also to increase the picturesque sense of expectation. Bass clarinet as the upper voice alongside bassoon on the lower thirds keeps them from sounding too warm and buzzy, but not too cool, as they might sound with second clarinet teaming up with bass clarinet instead of bassoon. Meanwhile, a tremolo pedal octave D sits below the precedings in cellos and violas, with no crescendo until the end of the second phrase, where it's joined by tremolo octave E's in the strings, which emerge out of the alto flute and clarinet pitches. So I started with emotional simplicity, perhaps even innocence, warmed into a more indulgent phrase, and then pulled back to a sense of familiar comfort. Now I have to take the music to a place of less certainty, and finish off the entire opening with a bittersweet sense of anticipation. For the start of the phrase, I use nearly the same approach as bars 4 and 5, pushing the dynamic briefly to forte, octave violins picking up from the same tremolo notes, doubled by first flute and first oboe, violas doubling sempre pianissimo horns, and cellos taking up the lower voice, doubled this time by the Swiss Army knife of wind instruments, the bass clarinet. Why did I not use bassoon again like the first time? Because I needed it to play a little duet with the English horn to finish off the phrase. This is actually a great opportunity to pair the two instruments, as the lower tenor register of the bassoon shares a beautiful camaraderie with the upper middle register of the English horn, especially paired in sixths and tenths as we see here. The violas double the English horn at the start, and then hang on to that tied F sharp as the melody proceeds without them. As to the rest of the orchestra, the violins telescope from a B octave down to a single held E, as do the same pitches doubled on flute and oboe. Notice that I let the seconds drop out immediately, but the oboe a little more slowly. Both flute and oboe will blend on that note with the first violins. It's just what kind of character do I want the blended tone to sound like? Warm with added oboe, or cool with added flute? I opt for coolness here, to contrast with the duo double wind solo below. An octave below, a single pianissimo horn doubling cellos is enough to keep the center of the sound picture warm without overpowering the other elements. Let's listen to the entire first page again, all the way through this time. Judge for yourself how effective a job I did with addressing my initial concerns of avoiding a static texture, keeping the slower tempo interesting while progressing the texture through different emotional spaces, and then at the end, letting the middle voice speak with clarity inside those octave E's. Then we'll take a look at the second half of rehearsal letter A before we go on to B. Let's quickly review my concerns from the original score about the content of the next section. Whether the expansion of scope for the pianist equals an expansion and progression of the emotion and timbre. Avoiding predictability in the treatment of left-hand patterns. And imbuing meaning into the middle voices. With all that in mind, let's jump back to my orchestration, focusing first on the interpretation of the melody. I felt from the start that merely transcribing the upper part note for note would not be enough to express the intensity required to set the scene. I wanted to add something to increase the tension of each phrase, underlining the natural swelling and ebbing of the dynamics. But all these intellectual calculations aside, I simply heard the solution without rationalizing it so much. To introduce additional harmonic tones to each chord, in this case nesting thirds inside each octave in voicings of ninth chords. That's not to say that I got everything right from the start by instinct. I reworked this passage a few times before settling on what you see here. Initially, I wanted the upper strings to float impressionistically an octave higher than originally scored by Barvinsky. But I ended up deciding on a more direct, fully engaged statement in the original register for the first 4 bars, and then leaping up an octave for dramatic emphasis, and also to leave some space in the sound picture for the development of the patterns below. You can see here that the role of adding the 7th and 9th pitches to each chord is taken entirely by divisi second violins, and in fact, there's very little wind doubling of any of the melodic elements in the strings, except for a tiny bit of strengthening here and there to underline the relationship of the harmonic tones in the violas to the concept of an independent middle voice, but not too much. At first we see it in the first clarinet, with the bass clarinet playing harmony from below in addition to patterning, which we'll discuss for its own sake in a couple of minutes. Then, as the strings leap up the octave, the doubling is taken over very naturally by a trade-off between middle register flutes and oboes. Here I can get away with flutes not being wasted against mezzo forte and forte strings, because I'm using them more to add color than to perfectly merge. And without any overly radiant elements from below like horns, they have a chance to contribute to the texture without being swallowed too completely. Also, they make an intriguing combination with upper register violas as opposed to violins. But the oboes won't have any problems contributing to the strength of the middle voice. Speaking of that middle voice, I couldn't resist injecting some contrary motion into this section by having the seconds play in opposition to the violas, keeping up that harmonic complexity. Now that we've really gone over the melody and elements of the middle voice throughout this screen, let's examine how I scored the left-hand patterns. I wanted them to feel like they naturally evolved out of the need for the orchestra to express a sense of motion and pacing, rather than just dropping pianistic gestures onto the bass instruments. My solution for the first half of the page is to transcribe the same left-hand notes onto the lower strings, dovetailing between basses and cellos on the second beat of every other bar. The harp doubles these parts at an octave above, then adds some rolling chords supporting the harmonized melody. The pattern for the second half of each bar is taken over by bass clarinet, which, as I mentioned before, bridges into supporting the middle voice and the violas. Notice the very careful management of dynamics for these first 4 bars, how the melody starts at mezzo forte, pushes into the middle of each phrase, backing off quickly to piano, and then warms back to mezzo forte again. The patterns from below emerge into the sound picture with each phrase instead of dominating them from the start. The combination of lower strings and harp that we just heard sets up the grounding pizzicato pluck in cellos and basses at the start of each bar in the second half of the page, freeing the rest of the pattern to flow independently across the middle range of the orchestra and the winds. Notice that here I've harmonized the patterns as well, partnering single reed with double reed instruments, but exchanging upper and lower voices of those harmonies between families with each gesture. English horn over bass clarinet, leading to the doubling of oboes with violas, then clarinet over bassoon, leading at first to the cooler flutes doubling violas on that middle voice, then to the second iteration, first oboe dovetailing with bassoon to maintain that same harmonic support under first clarinet. In this second half, the dynamics aren't quite as finessed. It's enough that there's a gentle push on each bar for the melodic phrases, and each gesture for the scoring of the patterns, culminating in the third and most emphatic push by the third bar. You'll notice that all these nuances don't really follow Barvinsky's original dynamics exactly, but I feel they bring out the meaning of the music much more clearly, and help the work to sound more authentically orchestral. Let's listen to the whole page now, with an ear to how the management of dynamics, the expansion of the melodic and harmonic material, and the reinterpretation of the left-hand patterns progresses the emotional context of the original score. If I've done my job correctly, then I'll have set up the content for the next section and can expand on that material in imaginative and convincing ways. Let's analyze another section of my Barvinsky orchestration before ending this video. Rehearsal Letter B, the second half of the episode which started at bar 11 in the first section. As it's a continuation rather than a new passage, some of the concerns will be the same, though they'll evolve along with the shaping of the music. As before, we'll have a continuing concern about the progression of texture in the right-hand material. But from the second system onwards, those chords become more of a background element behind the wandering lines that take flight from the left-hand patterns. More about them in a minute, but let's stick with our theme of continuing concerns brought forward from the previous section. The potential dangers of predictability in interpreting the left-hand part have not gone away, and neither has the concern about bringing meaning to certain notes of that left-hand part that are played as a middle voice by pianists. Then when those left-hand patterns reach up into the treble clef, will that represent an extension of the middle voice or something else? How can the orchestra interpret that sense of charming solitude, that wandering quality of the piano with the same emotion? And how can we craft a convincing transition between the patterns and the upward flow that emerges from them? To make things even more interesting, the last two bars on the page represent a pulling back of the emotional momentum along with the tempo. How will the wandering melody in the previous bar make a meaningful connection to this new material? And as another wandering melody emerges, how will it set up the next passage? Think about all those factors while we review this page along to Violina Petrochenko's performance once again. Keep in mind that along with these concerns, there's an obligation from the orchestrator to craft something that feels organic, as if the music evolved from ideas that were orchestral from the beginning rather than being expanded from a piano score. And of course that involves taking the long view of each phrase's dynamic and emotional character, progressing naturally through a series of colors and functions. Let's take our analysis in reverse order this time, starting with my orchestration of the left-hand part, and adding those upward wandering lines. And this time, I'm not just orchestrating the patterns, but the effect of the sustain pedal. Notice how the cellos and basses take it in turn to hold the first notes of each left-hand pattern, just as if it were pedaled. Then both combine by the fifth bar after rehearsal letter B. Even with the lower divisi cello note in the seventh bar, I'm still adding some sustain to the first note of the pattern. Speaking of which, you'll remember that I scored the patterns on the previous page as harmonized lines. Here in the oboe and clarinet, we can see the end of a previous phrase, dovetailing into harmonic support of the lower A in the divisi second violins, and the E in the violas. As the left-hand patterns proceed into this page, I've scored them trading off between first bassoon with the cellos sustaining the low note, then the cellos taking the pattern with the basses holding the low sustained note. The swelling dynamics in the middle of each phrase speak out in a way that fulfills the need for an outspoken middle voice as we heard in the piano version, as does the way that each of these soloistic phrases concludes, the bassoon hanging on to an F sharp at the end, but the cellos giving over gracefully to the violas, which supply the implied middle voice ending to the pattern. On the fifth bar after rehearsal letter B, I let the line start in the bassoon once again, to dovetail right in that sweet spot of compatibility between its tenor register and the English horn's middle register, and then dovetailing again at a similar point of compatibility between the English horn and the oboe. Notice the carefully managed dynamic arc across all three instruments, ending finally with the oboe fading out into the F sharp of the lower divisi first violins. The double reed line is answered by bass clarinet reaching upward to dovetail between its lower clarino F sharp 5, sounding E4, to the same sounding throat tone pitch on first clarinet, another very compatible place to trade off between wind instruments. Any decent pro-clarinetist should have a field day with the wandering melody that follows, and I'm giving them permission to push the dynamic up to mezzo forte and beyond if that naturally fits their approach. Then the final note fades into the alto flute's sounding E5 at the end. The overtones from both will appear to merge into the doubling of flute and first violins an octave above. And with that, I answer the question of how I'll connect the end of these wandering statements into the pulling back of momentum that follows. In both of those wandering melodies, I've added just a little touch of glockenspiel to the crest and the conclusion of each arc, just enough to make the lines glow a little, but not so much as to make them overly sweetened. Let's listen to this page with the mock-up, paying special attention to the flow of the patterns in the solo bassoon and cellos, culminating with the trading off between double reed and then single reed instruments for those wandering statements, then connecting into the slowing down at the end of the passage. Along the way, notice the way I've framed that material with the other elements, hopefully staying enough out of the way for the patterns and wandering melodies to stand on their own clearly. You'll remember on the previous page that I'd originally conceived my string scoring to be an octave higher throughout, but then changed my mind to only have that happen part of the time. The benefit here is that those strings can continue to hang in the air at first, buoyed up by glittering rolled harp, leaving an ample gap in the sound picture in which those patterns we just studied can easily be heard. And then the whole thing can descend and quieten down, naturally increasing the sense of intimacy while keeping out of the way of those patterns. I've really kept these first 8 bars of strings free of any thickening by winds or horns, so that the harp and the lower patterns have nothing to blot out their resonance. I even dropped the strings to a pianissimo tremolo when the single reed line goes wandering. So that answers 2 more concerns, of how the thematic content progresses emotionally, only to ultimately become a background texture. That simply leaves the problem of how to convincingly score the end of the passage. We already saw a point of connection where the first clarinet finished its wandering line merging into the alto flute part. My other way of connecting this ending onto the previous bars is to switch over from a tremolo string texture to a radiant upper wind texture, but have the first violin sit on top of the harmony. That helps to bridge between the 2 differing qualities of tone without diminishing the contrast. The colors are carefully placed across the harmonic voicing of the chord, with the flute family playing the original notes of the right-hand piano chord, with the oboe and bass clarinet adding warmth and harmonic context below while filling in the gap a little bit. Meanwhile, pizzicato basses underscore the viola and harp doubling in the left-hand figuration. As much as I'm describing these delicate touches in bringing a meaningful end to the passage, I feel that the most meaningful touch of them all is the management of the tempo here, ritardando to meno, then rallentando at the end. The original piano score has a marking of allargando, then poco più a tempo here, followed by ritardando at the end, which end up being very freely interpreted by pianists. I'm not sure how effective that truly would be as an orchestral tempo adjustment with this material, though such tweaking is pretty common with composers like Mahler. So here I've chosen to check the tempo with a slight increase of strength, then stay slower, ending with a rallentando rather than a straight ritardando. I feel that also supports the descending line working its way down from the first violins to the violas. You'll see that I dovetail over 3 notes rather than just 1, for a more gradual change of timbral quality, and then let the violas take the entire rallentando. I feel that's a great setup for the bustling, suppressed energy of the following section at C. We'll look over that part in the next lecture, along with the first half of section D. For now, this is probably a big enough bite for this video. Here's one last listen to the same material, this time with a focus on how the strings progress through their role of carrying the theme and then becoming more of a background element. When you get to the ritardando, listen for the ways I connect the 2 bars that end the passage with those that came before, and think about how I used the tempo to help emphasize the functions and character of different instruments. But before we do that, I just want to thank everyone who's participating in this year's Orchestration Challenge and all those who are supporting on Patreon. Your involvement makes all the difference in the world, and it's helping a lot of other orchestrators out there find the resources they need to keep on going with their passion. On behalf of them, I thank you all very much.